So I've been looking forward for many weeks to this panel. It's about the achievements of the Biden-Harris administration and how we message, organize, and energize based on those achievements in order to win in 2024. We have an absolute rock star panel. We've got Peggy Shepard, a national leader on advancing environmental justice in urban communities, who's not only the co-founder and executive director, just moving my stuff to get out of the way of the panelists. She's the co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice, and she also co-chairs WEJAC, which is the White House Environmental Justice Advisor Committee. She's won multiple major awards for her leadership on climate justice. My union sister and fellow Michigander, Liz Ratzloff, she's a scientist, a labor organizer, and co-executive director of the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is building the labor climate movement to achieve a sustainable, just future, just as we heard about from President Randy Weingarten. Mark Magaña is the founding president and CEO of GreenLatinos, and as a member, I can testify that Mark knows how to put together conferences and events where you learn so much about federal climate policy. It's good and mostly good, impacts good under the Biden-Harris administration, impacts on Latina communities, environmental justice, and have a lot of fun doing it. Mark has served as senior staff at both the White House and congressional leadership and was the first Latino to do both of those, correct? Got it. Megan Chan is the Vice President of Programs for our good friends at Friends of the Earth Action and is board chair of Amazon Watch and founder of BankTrack. She makes good trouble holding big money accountable. Thank you. And finally, Danielle Deiseroth, a longtime friend to this council, who's the executive director of progressive polling firm Data for Progress, and who started there in climate and environmental polling. So she's got her feet rooted in the right place. And now I cannot wait to kick off this conversation. But first, let's give them a big hand for being here. At the top, I just listed, some of the many accomplishments of this administration, and it's great policy. But we all know that we need to turn great policy into great politics. So how do we use these accomplishments to turn out voters? It's really important. And I was going to ask Peggy Shepard to please kick us off first.
So good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, first, we have to understand what the Biden-Harris administration has done. And in those first 100 days, Biden signed the executive order directing agencies to address environmental justice. Now, as co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, we have focused on bringing money and bringing services to communities of color to really address environmental inequity and the extreme weather that climate change brings, such as flooding and drought. Regular folks really need to understand the linkages between climate change and extreme weather events and local needs and impacts. We just had an amazing rain and flooding in the East Coast yesterday. Mm-hmm. We've got to link those kinds of events to climate policy so that regular folks who aren't thinking about these issues every day really understand what it means to them and their neighborhoods. They've got to really feel the impact. I was on a neighborhood bus and some folks were joking because they had just gotten a text from Biden to give money. And so when we got off the bus, they said, well, millions of dollars are coming into our neighborhood and our communities, and you really should understand that. And they said, thank you for telling me, but I don't feel it. And so I think we also have to understand what are the buttons that really motivate people. And we've got to push those buttons. And we've got, as climate advocates, we've also got to message education, housing, and the issues, health issues that people are really thinking about, pocketbook issues. So we've got to also be able to talk about climate policy, but talk about it in the perspective of other household issues that people are really concerned about. And so, again, the pocketbook issues are really important, but I believe we can craft a message that really links climate together with neighborhood issues of housing, education, and health.
Thank you. And anyone want to jump on that? Excellent idea. Other thoughts? Michelle? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just, the messaging is so important, and I think, linking it to, kitchen table issues and storytelling, which is something that We Act, for example, does very, very well. Labor Network, all of those organizations that are represented here do. Having people tell stories of how it's impacting them personally is really, really crucial and helps.
And the impacts we're feeling right now, this is the perfect time.
Yeah.
And we've got to follow up these incidents with the message.
Yeah, thank you. So we know turning out younger voters will be key to this election, and we also know that climate is a key issue for them. How can we best target those voters and turn them out using the environment? And I'm going to ask Danielle to respond first, and I think she's going to be sharing some slides, right? Shall I start them?
Yes.
You cue me when to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for having me here today. And I am so honored to be here and excited to share new research from Data for Progress, where I'm the executive director. And all of this polling is hot off the press, just conducted a few weeks ago. So what our poll finds, as what many of us in this room know to be true, is that climate change continues to be a major issue for voters this election cycle. We find that almost a third of all voters say that climate change is more important for their vote choice this year as compared to the last election. And this is especially true for Democrats, for young voters, and for Latino voters. To really underscore this point, on the next slide, only 28% of voters say that climate change is not important to their vote at all. Meanwhile, over half say it's important to them, and 14% of voters say that a candidate's stance on climate change is a deal breaker for whether or not they will vote for them. So what do voters think about Vice President Harris's plans to address climate change? Well, almost half say they have a positive view of her plans, but that number skyrockets to almost 2/3 when we look at voters who say they have heard at least some about her plans to tackle climate change. And I think this really underscores the importance of how delivering Vice President Harris's record on climate change throughout her career is critical over these next few months as we get closer to Election Day. And what we found with our partners at Climate Power is that Vice President Harris's record of tackling climate change and pollution throughout her career enjoys widespread bipartisan support. On the next slide, you'll see that across the board, issues ranging from strengthening the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, to passing the landmark Inflation Reduction Act, to tackling big polluters for how they've harmed communities, enjoy support across party lines. As we've heard so many times, climate change doesn't care whether you live in a red state or a blue state. And to see how voters across the political spectrum back Vice President Harris's record on climate is really remarkable. We also find, on the next slide, that over 60% of voters want Vice President Harris to carry the legacy that she's established with President Biden of tackling climate change head on. And voters want to see her continue passing ambitious climate action should she win a next term. And finally, just to do a little bit of a comparison, public opinion has remained remarkably stable over the past 4 years. We asked these questions back in 2020 and asked them again just a few weeks ago. And what we find is that over half of voters would be more likely to support a presidential candidate who supports making historic investments in clean energy infrastructure to create millions of new union jobs, building clean energy infrastructure, and creating an environmental justice fund to invest in communities that have disproportionately borne the brunt of pollution and climate change. And we know that Vice President Harris believes in all of these policies here. So this is what voters want to see.
Thank you so much. So, based on your own experience, both based on what Peggy said and what Danielle has said, we know messaging is important. what are the best messages we can use? Are they different for different communities, different ages, different geographies? And I was hoping Mark would kick us off with that conversation, and I hope everyone else will jump in.
Well, thanks, Michelle, and a big applause for you for taking on this role and for bringing us together and have the vision to do this work that the whole caucus does. Mark Magaña, founding president of GreenLatinos. We're a nationwide network of Latino environmental conservation climate justice advocates. We use our convening power to resource each other. We are a resource intermediary, and we are an advocacy coordinator. I'm speaking to you today as Mark Magaña, the son, the brother, the father, the husband, that cares deeply about what happens to my children and the future generation. Messaging-wise, it's easy to recite the broad, groundbreaking work that the Biden-Harris administration has done, from tackling the climate crisis with IRA and BIL to protecting the environment, huge movements to protecting large swaths of land, air, water, and ocean, and supporting EJ communities across the country. And we really have had, from the very first week, the focus on how we make sure that everyone benefits from this, EJ communities and all. And that's been a vital message. We need to increase the base of people who take this issue first and foremost and make sure that they're at the table. So we've been given the tools to make sure we can get the work done. But these record resources are only the beginning. We can't just be satisfied. There are many people that say that we have to have 5 times the amount as was in IRA and BIL to be able to tackle the climate crisis, just to start. We all need to get involved in the implementation of the IRA and BIL. We, for instance, GreenLatinos, we started something called Colaborativo 40, which was our effort to make sure that the Latino community, in partnering with the major Latino organizations, were ready for BIL and IRA and to be able to take advantage of these. We, for instance, GreenLatinos, had never thought that we would ever be a government grantee. But we decided that we were going to take the step, and my staff still hasn't forgiven me, but we're a USDA and EPA primary and sub-grantee. And it's been great to be able to help resource our community so that they can see these benefits. It's vital that the message that we, here and now, know that we're called upon right now to be the greatest generation, that we are the first generation to see the effects of the climate crisis and the last generation to be able to do anything about it, that we take lessons from our previous generations, our grandparents, our parents who sacrificed for us, who either immigrated or went through wars or a depression or held 3 jobs, who really sacrificed to make sure that their future generations had better opportunities. And that we know that now that mantle is on us, that we must do what it takes to match those greatest generations to be able to make sure that our future generations are able to have a livable planet. The Vice President Harris, has always heeded this call. When she was the first AG to set up a California statewide environmental justice commission, when she was, yes, years before anyone else did it, when she introduced in the Senate the Environmental Justice for All Act, the groundbreaking EJ bill, when she pushed for billions in clean electric school buses so that kids wouldn't be dying of asthma in the rate that they're dying now. This is the work that she did unnoticed for many years, but because she knew it was the right thing to do. I recently spoke to President Biden, and I told him he has 2 of the world's most important jobs. The second is president. First is grandfather. He nodded, he gave me his $1 million smile, and he agreed. We must be able to look our children and our grandchildren in the eyes when they ask us, what did you do when you had a chance to save the people on the planet? What did you do? We need to be able to look them in the eye and say, we marched. We organized. We rallied. We passed legislation. We got out the vote. We stopped a racist, fascist, felon, climate denying from being elected and being back into the White House, and we were able to move. climate believers like the future President Harris and Vice President Walz into the White House. This is our message, and we need to carry it forward.
Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly pass out the slides to the panelists, which I meant to do before, so they have them to refer to as they speak. But as I'm doing that, I am going to pose the next question, which is, what is one thing everyone in this room can do over the next few weeks to turn out climate voters? And I'm going to ask Liz to kick off the question to that, the answer to that.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm Liz Ratzloff, the co-executive director of the Labor Network for Sustainability, and we're building a powerful movement of labor and climate, a powerful labor climate movement, so that we're fighting for just transition and ensuring that we have an ecologically sustainable and economically just society and world for everyone to live in. And one of the important things that touches on a lot of the questions that Michelle has asked today is the fact that with the climate crisis and addressing the climate crisis, we have the opportunity to solve a whole lot of different issues that are the priorities of climate voters too. Racial justice and income inequality, especially for young voters. This is something that is a huge, huge priority. They don't want just climate action. They want intersectional, real change that's going to make a difference in people's lives. And that's what we can use this opportunity with the climate crisis to do. We have seen, I'm so glad that Randy Weingarten from AFT was here. We see educators across the country starting climate councils in their unions, fighting in their workplaces for green schools, for investments in their communities. And they're really on the leading edge of the labor movement, taking a stand and leading on real climate action that makes a difference in people's lives. And we see folks at local governments who are looking at their budgets that are going to be decimated or already being decimated by the climate crisis and natural disasters in their area. That directly affects the bottom line of the local governments, of what their salaries, their coworker salaries, could possibly be in the future. And so we see folks organizing together, using their power as a worker, not just as a voter, not just as a community member, but also as a worker, demanding that their employers are part of the solution and don't continue to contribute to the climate crisis. And because of the incredible investments that we have, especially at the local level, there's an opportunity for workers to come together and ensure that everyone can make a living wage on a living planet. And so one thing that everyone can do is talk to their coworkers. Talk to their coworkers about how the climate crisis affects you, how your priorities are potentially affected by the climate crisis, whether it's natural disasters, effects on public budgets, or pollution in communities. And talk about how, in addition to voting, to electing climate champions, we can ensure that we're getting affordable housing, expansion of mass public transit, all solutions to the climate crisis, and also things that will make meaningful changes in people's lives that everyone wants to see.
Thanks, I love that. We often talk about talking to your friends and your family, but also talking to your coworkers is incredibly important. Any other very quick 10 to 30 second responses to that question? Go ahead.
Just to underscore your point, what we see in our polling is that folks say that they trust their friends, their families, their community groups the most to deliver them news about climate change. So the importance of talking to who you know, it just really cannot be more stated. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right. So what, how do we get, there's still a false narrative out there. A false narrative that climate is not a voting issue. And it's a big question. How do you push back on that? We've got the data, right? But what are some things that we can do? And I was going to ask Michelle to jump in and respond to that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Michelle, for pulling this all together. It's really impressive and great. Michelle Chan, Vice President of Programs for Friends of the Earth Action. And we do, in fact, have the polling. Danielle's just shared some super hot off the press polling with us just minutes ago. But for those who are getting out the vote and trying to figure out, well, should I go and knock on the door? Should I go to talk to people, with climate change first in mind? There's some fantastic polling that also shows that 72% of young voters who say they care about climate are more likely to be extremely likely to vote at the rate of like 72%. And that is compared to about 57% of young voters who say that they would be likely to vote. So we know that people who care about climate really are more likely to vote. So that's a great reason to go out and lead with that. I mean, and for electeds and candidates who are wondering, well, should I lead with climate as well? Yes, because we know that elections are close, right? And even though that climate may not be the number one issue, that, Biden took Georgia by 10,000 votes, right? Climate is enough of an issue to matter. There are some fantastic studies out of University of Colorado who show that climate change was materially impactful in the last 2 elections, right? Mm-hmm. And honestly, if you don't include climate change in your platform, there's going to be plenty of people out there looking at you with side eye saying, what's wrong with that? And so just to close off, I wanted to speak a little bit to the messaging issue, because we know that messaging to young voters is super important. Biden and Harris did a great job with the Inflation Reduction Act, and we need to keep Harris in the White House because she needs to continue the job of holding the fossil fuel industry to account and taking on the fossil fuel industry, right? And we know this really, really matters to young people. Yeah, I mean, they care about the renewable side, but they really do care about taking on the fossil fuel industry. So just as Rokana said, I think his messaging is spot on. Take on the fossil fuel industry. She has a good track record as AG in taking on Chevron, Exxon, ConocoPhillips, et cetera, and cut those fossil fuel subsidies. We have an incredible chance next year as the Trump tax cuts kind of come to a close. There's going to be a big fight. And most fossil fuel subsidies are tax giveaways, right? So we can do this.
Thank you. We don't need to be giving money away to the fossil fuel companies. So I am so grateful to our panelists as they leave the stage. Let's give them a big hand. That was an excellent conversation.